Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of that big bad boy known as the Renaissance, right? Continuing our continuing our discussion that we left off in classroom where we were finishing up talking about some of those early humanists, right? So we're going to be moving into a lot more of the minutia-based stuff about the Renaissance today. But again, it's going to be really, really important to remember that it's not all about the idea of like trying to memorize all of it, trying to remember every single little detail. It's about looking at the overall theme and understanding how these different items or these different things support the concept that the Renaissance was a period of rebirth, right? That humanism is a major element of that rebirth, right? Supporting the idea that a lot of it breaks down into the, like, going into, like, translating stuff and understanding ancient writings and stuff like that, right? So the number one thing about it, though, is to not just get swept up into trying to remember every single little thing. But let's pick up right where we left off in class when we left off talking about Lorenzo Valla, right? Lorenzo Valla, which, of course, is going to be the very major important person who, like, exactly like Rosie said in class, is, like, going to be the guy that realizes that the donation of Constantine, the document that said that the Pope is the highest power in the Western Church, was actually a forgery. I know, right? Dun, dun, dun. Like, the fact that that document wasn't even written by Constantine himself. He actually was able to discover this by one key idea. Lorenzo Valla apparently had gotten so good at translating text from Latin that he was able to identify grammatical differences between Old Latin and New Latin, right? And what is this going to do? Yet be another crack in the facade that is the embodiment, the fortitude, the shield of Christianity and Catholicism coming out of the Middle Ages. Now, it is important to note, okay, real quick disclaimer, that none of the stuff that we're about to talk about whenever the Catholic Church was corrupt in either this unit or the next unit has any bearing or any indication on the current day Catholic Church, all right? It's completely two different things. Like Pope Francis himself has come out and apologized for many different things that have happened in the past. And so we need to understand that the modern day Catholic Church is much more of a, like, purified church than the corrupt one that was being led by corrupt people during the 1400s and 1500s, okay? But going into it, though, okay, gotta give that little disclaimer, right? The big thing about it, though, going into it as well, he's going to figure out that that document is just not actually really written by Constantine and that it holds no true water, right? And so that is going to be, in essence, that some of the early, like symbols of how scholasticism is beginning to spread and it's beginning to change people's thoughts and opinions on a lot of different stuff, right? But now what we're getting into is after people like Lorenzo Valla and Alberti and Ficino and Bruni and guys like that, right? After we've analyzed these different people that are your earliest humanists, Boccaccio, right? All that other stuff, once we get past that end, we start seeing that humanism is going to begin to split. And it's going to start taking on new kind of traits and properties, and certain humanists are going to focus on certain things, right? And kind of hone their skills in a little bit, right? And so one of the earliest forms of humanism that we see pop up after this split is this thing called civic humanism, right? And civic humanists try to ask one very simple thing: how can humanism be applied to everyday life, right? Like, how can it be applied to the things that we do normally, how we educate people, how we decide on our government, and things like that, right? Civic humanists are trying to figure out what can we do to make life better for the regular person, right? What can we do to try and actually, like, reform things, to advise leaders better, and to make it better for the rest of us, right? Well, civic humanists are going to be very, very important, especially in Italy, because the first one that we're going to talk about really focused a lot on education and lifestyle, right? And again, these are Italian ones. Notice I have Italian in parentheses because we're going to come up to another intrinsic Renaissance split here in about 2 seconds, okay? Now, the thing about it, though, is our very first civic humanist is a guy named Baldassare Castiglione, right? Now, Baldassare Castiglione, right, with that little fancy portrait right there, who looks a lot like a young Roland Terry, my dad. Now, the big thing about it, though, okay, going into it, Baldassare Castiglione, that portrait was actually painted by Raphael, also, by the way, now, is a very, very important humanist because of his book and work that he wrote known as the Quartier, right? So the thing about Baldassare is this book is going to be not transcendental, it's going to be a very important tome, if you will, a very important text that's going to, like, try to signify the new Renaissance social, like, what am I trying to say? Hold on. Okay, we can do this better, okay? Baldassare Castiglione's book, The Courtier, is trying to set the new standard for Renaissance society and behavior. That's the words that we're looking for right there, all right? So the courtier is a guidebook, okay? And basically, though, the courtier is still going to be very important because it's going to directly really kind of like push or change how education was viewed in Europe, right? So the courtier was a guidebook of discipline for courtly gentlemen, right? Now, what a courtier is, just to give you a heads up, okay? A courtier is a person that is so well educated that they can advise a king, right? So a courtier is someone who exists in the court of a king, right? Or in a king's court, and they are so well-rounded, well-versed, well-developed in their thoughts, practices, musicality, all of the above, honestly, because looking at this list right here, this is what Castiglione said a courtier should be able to do, right? But so well developed that he can advise a king and guide him in the right direction, right? That's a courtier, right? Because the court parties were a very, very big aspect of Renaissance society as well as 15th and 16th century Europe, right? And also 17th century Europe. We'll keep going with it, okay? The court life and courtly ideas are a very big deal. And we'll talk about it and how it works and stuff like that in class. Kind of try to explain what a court is because it's very, very difficult to really kind of nail down. But the thing about it, though, is that according to Castiglione, if you are somebody who can compose a sonnet, play an instrument, wrestle to show your athleticism, sing, solve mathematical problems, paint, and do all these other different versatile skills, use rhetoric, translate Latin and Greek, be educated, be smart. It demonstrates to him that he believes that you are that well-versed in all these different subjects that you can advise a king in their roles, right? Now, the question is, though, is that did he also include women in this, okay? Being a Catholic school educator at an all-girls school, I think it's very important to bring in the view of women in society during all these places. And Baldassare Castiglione did say that women should be able to do as all these things that a man can do as well, minus like the wrestling and the athleticism and stuff like that, which is ridiculous, okay? One of y'all can like take somebody out, beat somebody up if you want to. I believe in you. So, like, now, look, I think that, you know, like, Gabrielle, like she could take somebody. So a big thing about it, though, okay, going into it, he also said that women should be composed and beautiful, though, as well, which is a little bit weird and sexist, but we're going to let it go, okay? But the thing about it, though, okay, Baldassare Castiglione, this book will then be kind of used as almost the first textbook on how nobles and lords and dukes and barons and earls and grafs and all those people begin to try to decide on how to educate their children, right? To try and make it so that they can like kind of accelerate their way through the court lifestyle, right? Because a big thing that's going to happen as monarchs gain more power is court rankings is going to be really big, right? How better are you than the ones that how better are you than the rest of the courtiers out there so that you can gain prestige and get close to the ruling class, right? So speaking of ruling class, though, we also need to understand that civic humanists are going to very, very much apply their thoughts and ideas to the government, all right? So the big one, the one that we need to understand is going to come in the wake of this guy named Girolamo Savonarola, okay? So the government one has to be preceded with a little story, right? Before you can talk about the government humanists that, like, to any of the adults or parents or possible, like, randos watching this YouTube video. I know I got a couple of fans in Russia, apparently. The thing that we need to understand is that this guy that was such a big deal, not Savonarola, not this weird dude giving the side eye right there, the guy that we're about to talk about that is a civic humanist that focused his ideas on how a government should change and operate in the new Renaissance Europe as to be effective and, like, also, like, effective and pointed and then like as successful as possible and keep order as best they could. It all came in the wake of this guy named Girolamo Savonarola, right? Now, Girolamo Savonarola, who he is, okay, he's a monk, all right? So now, Savonarola, who looks like this, right, okay, is a guy that showed up in Renaissance Florence, all right, and he began to preach these really big fiery sermons, right? And in these big fiery sermons, he was like, all of you in this new era of Florence are being blinded by your vanities, right? You're being blinded by your vanities, your things, your objects, your dresses, your perfumes, your makeup, your art, your this, your that, and the society that this family, the Medicis, have ushered in is the thing distracting you from God, and that a new Cyrus is going to show up, and Cyrus is from the Old Testament, it's referring to Cyrus the Great, right, of Persia, is going to show up and cleanse all of you of your vanities and destroy us if you do not right your ways. And the second he's giving this big fiery intense speech, and then all of a sudden, a couple months later, this guy named Charles the Eighth, I think it's Charles the Eighth, I'll have to look that up, he's 8th or 9th. So like from France, right, the king of France, invades northern Italy and ransacks a big chunk of Florence. So it freaks everybody out. And so they begin to actually follow Girolamo Savonarola, right? And the Medicis get exiled in the wake of that invasion, right? In the wake of that invasion that seemed eerily like this guy, this monk had predicted it, right? They all like kind of freak out. They exile the Medicis, and they begin to have these things known as bonfires of the vanities, right? And the bonfires of the vanities were literally these big, big bonfires where everybody would bring their vain things out, right? Their dresses, their perfumes, their jewelries, their art. A lot of art was actually destroyed in these bonfires, right? And these big, big fires where they like consume them. A couple of famous Italian artworks, and one specifically that we'll talk about here in a little bit, was actually saved from one of these fires because they hid it so it actually didn't end up in one of these fires. So we actually lost quite a bit of very famous art to the bonfires that Girolamo Savonarola started, right? But these big bonfires were happening, and he all but took over complete rulership of Florence, right? But what's going to end up happening is the Pope at the time is going to, who I believe, let's see, at this time it would have been probably Sixtus. I'll have to look that up. Now, the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at this, you have to understand the Pope was just like, hey, Girolamo, big fella, just so you know, you're really, really affecting my tithe collection, and also you've like exiled the Medicis who were in charge of the bank that I use, so I'm going to need you to stop doing all this crazy stuff in Florence. And Savonarola refused, and he was like, I will not stop doing this because I am preaching the words of God, and also I perfected the prophecy and the blah, blah, blah. And so what ends up happening is the Pope actually has Girolamo Savonarola put in front of an inquisition, tried, and sentenced to death. And guess what? In the same place where they actually had those bonfires of the vanities, they had Girolamo Savonarola burned at the stake, right? And it's right outside of this place called the Palazzo del Vecchio, right? So like outside of the Medici's ancestral home, there's the Duomo right there over in the corner, and then the Piazza della Signoria, which is like the oldest square, and there's the Loggia right there, which is the Medici sculpture garden. He was actually burned right there on top of a little brass plate that actually sits right in the actual court itself, right? So the thing about it though is, in the wake of this, the Medicis weren't brought back into Florence immediately, right? And so what happened was this guy was actually hired to be the accountant and secretary to one of the new ruling groups. The Signoria of Florence hired this guy named Piero Soderini, and his assistant and secretary and accountant was a man by the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Niccolo Machiavelli is going to be very, very important to the rest of this course, okay? Niccolo Machiavelli is wicked important, okay? The guy literally may have written one of the most important books in European history ever when it comes to diagramming, understanding, and trying to actually manufacture a government that he believed at the time in Renaissance Italy would have been the perfect form, right? And just like many of the other classical humanists that came before him, including Plato and Aristotle, understanding the best king is a question that many humanists ask. So just like them, Niccolo Machiavelli used some of their ideas, used some of this different stuff, and he began to come up with theories of his own, right? Now, the thing about it, this is while the Medicis were gone. But when the Medicis came back, he was arrested, he was tortured, and eventually released, but exiled out of Florence for the rest of his life. He spent a lot of time in Siena, for any of y'all that have ever actually considered going there. It's absolutely beautiful. They have this massive horse race every single year, which it's apparently the most exciting 30 seconds of sports because it doesn't take very long. So now the big thing about it, though, okay, you have to understand, is he was arrested, tortured, and eventually released and exiled. And after he was exiled, he wrote a book, right? And that book is going to change the way that Europeans think about the government, right? And that book is known as The Prince, right? Now, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli is not a very long book. It's only about 100 pages, right? It's very, very short. You could read it sometime if you very, very much want to. You will have excerpts of it on your test without a shadow of a doubt. But this bad boy basically becomes the secular handbook for kings to read to decide how are they supposed to best rule over their people. And the key message that exists within inside this book known as The Prince is that a ruler is meant to preserve order and security at all costs. Notice what I just said, at all costs, right? You must do it at all costs, right? How are you going to do that, though? He believed that humans were ultimately extremely selfish, right? He believed that people like the Medicis and believed that the people that had followed Savonarola and gone along with his ideas and burned the things in the bonfire of the vanities and all this stuff, that they were ultimately selfish and trying to better themselves of their situation, right? That, for example, they were like, oh, they were scared and in fear, so Savonarola played upon that, right? Oh, well, they were a part of a good economic period, so that's why people loved the Medicis for so long, right? But the big thing about it, though, is he also believed that human beings can be extremely self-destructive, which he witnessed whenever Savonarola came to his rise in power. To control them, he said that a good king must ask and beg themselves one very specific question. Is it better for me to be feared or loved? Is it better for me, for my people, to quake in their boots while I walk through the streets, or should they cheer my name as though I am one of their own, right? What should they want? And to take a second to kind of consider the answer to that, right? Machiavelli does a lot of work where he tries to figure out what should these two be better off being, and he comes to the conclusion that apparently if you cannot be both of them, right? He said it's possible to be both, but it is better to be feared if one cannot be both. Reason why is because he said that a fearful or a feared king is a strong one that can preserve order by using brutality, war, and kindness as long as you keep power maintained and keep the people of your country safe, right? So he's basically saying, in essence, that the Medicis, if they were truly good leaders, would have squashed Savonarola's little uprising before it ever really got any wheels on it, right? He said brutality, war, and power are all condoned as long as you get it done the right way. However, you should strive to be both feared and loved, if you possibly can, right? And he apparently, literally modeled a lot of this off of this guy named Caesar Borgia. And Caesar Borgia was the illegitimate son of Alexander VI, right? Who also may very well have actually been the Pope when actually Savonarola was in power, because Alexander VI was very, very close by to Julius II, and Julius II is the same guy that had the Sistine Chapel ceiling painted, right? And these guys hated each other. Him and Alexander II, or like Julius II, I mean, the Pope and Alexander II hated each other's guts. But the thing about it is Alexander II, right, or excuse me, Alexander VI, actually had an illegitimate son, because his real name in real life, Alexander's real name in real life, was Rodrigo Borgia, and his illegitimate child was named Caesar Borgia, who actually ruled over several different provinces in this time in northern Italy. And he actually modeled his belief of what a good ruler would be like off of that guy, watching him actually use brutality when necessary and use kindness when necessary as well. Critiques of power and governance are a pillar of Greek and Roman philosophy, so Machiavelli might not have agreed with what Plato thought the perfect king would be, because Plato thought the philosopher king was the ultimately perfect king, one that actually is well-educated, just, and social, right? But still, he read these different ideas and he came up with ones of his own in the guise and the idea of those ancient humanists, right? So Machiavelli is going to be wildly important, okay? Wildly, wildly important. To this day, a lot of people use the word Machiavellian wrong, right? Whenever they say Machiavellian, they basically think somebody who's being cunning and crass, right? Okay, but it actually is being misconstrued. Machiavelli, 9 times out of 10, and The Prince was trying to be ironic. And then also in the long run, it actually being Machiavellian just means you're very pragmatic, right? Like, so it means you're very, good at, figuring out what needs to be done when necessary, right? Now, the big thing, though, that many of you probably know from the Renaissance more than anything else is its artwork, right? Now, just looking at the artworks that just popped up just now, you should be able to, after reading those articles, tell me if those artworks are Middle Ages or Renaissance. And listening in the background, I hear Cassie back there right now going like, I think it's Middle Ages, because, she's loud and really, yells answers in class all the time, right, Cassie? The big thing about it is she's right, okay? This is very much Middle Ages art. This is medieval art, right? It's heavy with religious symbolism. It is flat. Everybody has the same face, you know what I mean? Also, little baby Christ is up here just, throwing up hands, you know what I'm saying? Talking to these other people. The big thing about it, though, is it's flat, doesn't have a lot of definition, it's gilded in the background, doesn't have any kind of geometric perspective. This, you can tell, is Middle Ages architecture because it's Gothic and everything's pointed. There's spires and flying buttresses and stained glass windows and pointed archways and vaulted ceilings. And this right here is very much Middle Ages sculpture. You can tell because it's attached to the altar of a church, or not the altar necessarily, but to the exterior of a church, the nave of the church. That's the word I'm looking for. So, now, the big thing about it is actually attached. They are solid, rigid, and they do not exude Greek or Roman figure at all, right? Whereas this stuff is very Italian, right? That is Italian Renaissance art, right? Some of you have probably seen some of these before. We'll talk about some more of them more specifically in class, right? But that one right here is The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. This is Michelangelo's David, which is housed in Florence, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the best pieces of art I've ever seen in my entire life. The ridiculousness of this artwork in particular, y'all, is look how humanistic in perspective it is, right? He literally is a full-formed in the in the stance of a Roman Greek god or goddess, right? But he is a biblical figure, okay? The detail alone in this thing, you can see the muscle in his neck, the clavicle bone, the ridges of his chest muscles, right? His gaze is very, very important. You can see the curls in his hair and the sling that he would destroy Goliath with, just draped over his shoulder, oh so casually, right? Also, fun fact as well, Michelangelo actually also made his head and his hands a little bit bigger for 2 reasons. Because in the Bible, apparently one, the Bible said that David was strong of hand, meaning that he was very, very good in shape, and he was a shepherd and stuff like that. And then also he made his head a little bit bigger as well, because he was supposed to be seen from this dome, right? Actually, David was supposed to sit on the exterior part of the dome originally, but the Medicis fell in love with the sculpture so hard that they bought it and actually put it outside in their loggia sculpture garden, right? But this dome also is very Renaissance. Look at the symmetry and the clean lines and things like that, and using no wooden scaffolding or not using any kind of interior support structure, it being an open dome and an open drummed dome at that, and also still to this day is the largest brick masonry dome in the world, right? This right here is another piece of Renaissance art, the Mona Lisa by Da Vinci, because it represents several different seasons in the background. It is very humanistic and detailed, and it uses naturalism. But this one's my favorite one. That's the one that almost got burned up in the Bonfire of the Vanities. This is the Birth of Venus, right, by Botticelli, Sandro Botticelli. And it's very, very good because look at the reignition of Greek and Roman figures, right? These are Greek and Roman figures that actually, that exude the story of the birth of Venus, the Roman form of Aphrodite, coming out of the sea on her shell, being clothed by Flora and being blown in by Zephyrus and Chloris, right? So now, you've got an entire mythological story happening in a very famous painting with natural human figures, proportional human figures, and also using geometric perspective. Now, are there some similarities between Middle Ages art and Renaissance art? Of course there are, right? So there's a lot of symbolism, religious themes, right? Almost all art that was made during the Middle Ages was Christian, right? So typically Christian used, because the Christian was, not Christianity was paying for it, the church was paying for it, and also demonstrating it and showing it off and stuff like that. Of course there's religious themes, right? And symbolism in Middle Ages art just as much as there was as well. But Renaissance art is intrinsically different from Middle Ages art for several different reasons, right? Italian Renaissance art, it separates itself in the use of, one, art being used as a form of political power and prestige, right? Something that we need to understand is that a lot of people were trying to patron art or buy art. By the way, that's a word you need to know, patronage, right? P-A-T-R-O-N. AGE, or patron, is who buys the art, right? Now, the thing about it that we're looking into is popes, the church, Julius II, later on Clement VII paid for this bad boy, also by Michelangelo, the last major work that he ever did. That is the Last Judgment. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is actually right here. It's where it begins. That's Jonah's feet right there, okay? So as an old prophet and stuff like that. But all these different works were bought for and paid for by different popes and figures, rulers, right? This one was also paid for by a pope. That is the School of Athens. It was paid for by Julius II, the same guy that paid for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This one is actually in a monastery in Milan. That is the Last Supper, right? So, of course, the church was using its money to actually enhance its political power and prestige at the time. And then also the Medicis are the ones who paid for the Birth of Venus, right? And so the Medicis used the artwork to enhance their political power and prestige as well through patronage. Now, another big thing about it, though, is naturalism. Italian Renaissance art uses naturalism, and it's what separates the Renaissance as a new art movement. Naturalism means it's portraying the world as it is, right? Doing human bodies in proportional stance, giving them unique features, one to the other, making it so the figures are uniquely themselves in their own, rather than using all the same face, right? It's not flat, it's not static, it implores movement. That's a big one as well. They use the stance known as contrapposto, which is a big one, all right? And that's also where the nudity comes from, because what's more natural than a human being wearing nothing? So but that's, of course, for example, in this piece in particular, Michelangelo was told that he had to go in and cover everybody's stuff up after the fact because somebody got all upset. They were like, there's too many naked people in this picture. And then that same guy that told him that, he was like, all right, fine, I'll show you. And he painted him in hell right here, getting bitten by a snake, which is a fun story. We'll talk about it in class. But the big thing about it, though, okay, going into it, portraying the world as it is a naturalized idea. And that's a big reason why there's so much nudity in it. Because the same thing is this is all in the image of Greeks and Romans. Greeks and Romans believed that the human form was so beautiful that not only should it be used in artwork, but also it should be represented in athletics. In the original Olympics and the ancient Olympics that began in about 700 BC, Greek Olympians competed in the nude, right? So keep in mind that this is, of course, a hearkening back to the classical values of these other places. They also use geometric perspective as well, because actually you can see vanishing points in multiple different pieces of art throughout this era, right? For example, the vanishing point on this Last Supper is right in Christ's forehead, and you can see the lines that converge right here onto his forehead to give the picture depth and perspective, right? Same thing, too, as well. In the School of Athens, the vanishing point in geometric perspective is right here, and then the lines radiate out, giving the depth and three-dimensional value of this new form of art. And famous artists like this include Botticelli, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, right? Just to name a few. You could go on for days. You could say, like, you know, Donatello. You could say, God, who else are some other, like, great Italian artists? You could say, oh, but like Brunelleschi himself, Ghiberti, Lorenzo Ghiberti's a big one as well. Tons and tons and tons of them. Oh, Cellini a little bit later on is my favorite Italian sculptor, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is that art is the thing that's usually given the most attention when you're talking about the growth of the Renaissance. And that's why it makes it thing that you need to understand about this whole movement as well is asking yourself, notice I kept putting the word Italian next to everything, right? Everything said Italian art or Italian writing or Italian early humanists and stuff like that. But the question you need to ask yourself is, well, did the Renaissance just stay in Italy? And the answer to that is a big fat no, all right? It did not just stay in Italy. It would be silly to assume that the Renaissance just stayed and began in Italy. And ironically enough, you could argue that it wasn't necessarily completely rooted in Italy completely, but it is where the most seeds were sown, if you want to get into that. The thing about it, though, is that the Italian Renaissance spread, right? It intrinsically spread throughout the rest of Europe, right? And the Renaissance spread to the northern European area, or excuse me, the northern Europe part of, excuse me, what am I trying to say? Here we go. The Renaissance began to spread to northern Europe, countries that include the HRE, which is a fun little abbreviation for the Holy Roman Empire. By the way, for those of you who are wondering what the heck the Holy Roman Empire is, it's Germany before it was Germany. It's mostly German-speaking states, okay? Like now, so France is a big one as well, the Netherlands, England, etc. And a lot of that has to do with the reasons of trade and the printing press, right? Trade is beginning to advance itself, and economics are beginning to grow in Europe, so the ideas of the Renaissance are beginning to diffuse throughout the rest of the continent. And then also the recent advent of the printing press that was developed in the 1440s by Johannes Gutenberg is going to help spread written material further than it's ever gone, making books more tangible, accessible, and also easier to study by scholars and also Scholastica in general throughout the rest of Europe. You're welcome. Now, the big thing about it, though, okay, it is going to continue to spread, and both Renaissances have religious themes, right? Both Italian and Northern one has religious themes. Classical literature is on the rise in both of these areas, and an increased production in art. But taking a gander at all these bad boys, I want you to do me a favor real quick and just take a good look at all of them, right? That's the Ambassadors by Hans Holbein. That's the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck. That's the Night's Watch by Rembrandt, right? Okay, this one is the Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch, right? And then, of course, this one is one of my favorites. That's the Ox Carcass or the Ox Slaughter by Rembrandt, right? Looking at these different pictures and stuff like that, you can kind of maybe screenshot this and zoom in a little bit if you would like, or kind of listen to the titles I just said. Another thing I want you to do for one of our warm-up questions tomorrow is taking a gander at those. I want you to tell me what you think the major differences are between Northern Renaissance art and Italian Renaissance art, all right? But we're going to cut it right there. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a great evening.